Welcome to this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have with us Christi Sumich. She is a historian, she is an author, a lifelong resident of New Orleans, holds a PhD in history, and we'll learn from her why getting historical fiction right matters, how she balances facts with fiction, and what it means to write New Orleans itself as a character. So let's discover how stories can teach us about another time and place in ways that facts alone cannot. Welcome to the show, Christy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
You are welcome. Welcome to the show, Christy. Welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk right now. We'll talk about how one can bring history to life through fiction. That's what you are doing. So we'll learn about that and much more. But before that, let's learn a bit about your journey, your background, so that the audience knows who they are listening to.
Okay, sure. Well, I was born and raised in New Orleans, and the first half of my career was as an academic, mostly in higher education, but also some in secondary education. So, spent my time in the classroom or as an administrator. And my master's degree was in English, but then I pursued a PhD in history. And I was really focused on not even so much New Orleans history. I actually studied British history, disease and medicine in the early modern period. So things like bubonic plague and all that kind of thing. And so I spent about 10 years between writing my dissertation and selling that to an academic publisher and turning it into a monograph. Lots of footnotes, typical academic book. And I remember getting the books in the mail, that first box of books that you get as the author. And I was so proud of the book and opening it up and showing it to my children who were, kind of young at the time. And they said, "That's great, Mom. Next time you write a book, can it be something that people want to read?" And I thought, okay, that's probably a pretty solid idea. So went on with my career. And then later in life, as my youngest was about to go away to college, and my oldest was getting married literally the day before I took my youngest with my husband off to college, I thought, it's time for me to have an encore career. I need to figure out what I want to do for me. And my bucket list item had always been writing, but not academic writing. I wanted to write what I wanted to write. And so that journey began in nonfiction because that's what I was used to. And I tapped my mother, got her involved. She's a retired attorney, but she's also a New Orleans tour guide. She has a history background. She just knows a lot about the history of the city. So we wrote a New Orleans cocktail book that focuses on, like Halloween, spooky season, but it had a lot of New Orleans history and culture in it. And we had a blast writing that book. And then we ended up writing another cocktail book together. But I still had that yearning to write a novel. And so I thought, let's take my love of history and turn it into something that's also a creative outlet. And so that's when I started kind of fishing around for ideas about what I wanted to write on, and ended up writing about an ancestor of mine who was a pirate in this area of the world in the early 19th century. His name is Jean Lafitte. And so I was able to use my background as a historian to kind of fuel the ideas for the creative writing that went into producing the novel. So it just seemed kind of like a natural step, but it was a scary one at the time to make that transition from academic books to general nonfiction to fiction.
Absolutely, absolutely, Christy. So I want to understand, what is it that you want to tell the world through your book, through what you are talking?
Well, I think that historical fiction is kind of the perfect genre in that it is transportive, as all fiction is. It takes you to a different place. It lets you see someone else's perspective, and it's a perspective that you would normally be separated by by hundreds of years, and you can, I think it changes the way we look at everything when we read a good piece of fiction. And so that would be the ultimate goal of what I want to do. But I'm very, very careful as a historian that when I'm writing fiction, the part of it that is historically accurate, you need to get it right. I think we have to do our due diligence. I treated this subject matter as I would an academic subject matter. I did the research. I looked at what different historians were saying, because they're in this subject, the life of a pirate who doesn't want people to know details about his life. Historians don't agree on most of even the basic facts. When he was born, for instance, they know he was born in the 1780s, but we don't know an exact year. Some historians say he was born in France. Some say he is born in what is now Haiti. Some say New Orleans. Some say Spain. And so you, as a historian, have to take all of that into consideration and build your story. It gave me some a little bit of creative wiggle room, but I was very careful. The parts of the book that are based on fact are factual. And I even put a section at the end, and I think a lot of historical fiction authors do this, but mine is kind of lengthy, where I do my author's notes, and I'll say, this is historically accurate. This is legend. It may be true. It may not be true. And then this is what I completely made up to fit my story. But I think it's balancing that, because readers of historical fiction want to learn about that period of time, or those series of events, or deep dive into that historical character. And so it's very important that as historical fiction authors, we're giving them something that is accurate. I hope that people read my novel and want to know more about Jean Lafitte, and then go look at the nonfiction that's been written about him and do a little research. Like I think if you can make history come to life for people in that way, that you're helping people understand the importance of history and how it really has so much to teach us about the world we live in today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And talking of John Lafitte, did you always know about your connection with him? Or is it that you came to know later on, and then later on you decided to write on him?
Yes, it's an interesting story. So I am supposedly, as family legend goes, related to him. He's an ancestor of ours. What you have to understand is that in this area of the world, in New Orleans, and then down into the Barrett area, which is a region south of the city, there are lots of references to Jean Lafitte. There are towns named after him, streets, places. He has a great amount of lore and legend still alive in the city. And a lot of people claim roots to him. And so I could never prove that we are related to him. My family on my mother's side inherited property supposedly from him in Barrett area. And we also have in our possession, well, that we've now donated to the Historic New Orleans collection, but we had a series of papers that he wrote. It was a contract that he wrote in 1805 with one of his other privateers to go and capture ships, bring them back to Barrett area, and it outlines exactly how the spoils are to be divided. It's very meticulous. It's basically a legal document, though it's a legal document to possibly do something illegal, whether you believe he's acting as a privateer, government sanctioned, or as a pirate, not government sanctioned. And so these papers were gifted to my parents, and they had them framed. There are about 8 of them. They are written front to back because parchment was very expensive in 1805. And so you did not waste paper. So front and back written in this very flowy French script that I couldn't read, but I could see his signature at the bottom, Jean Lafitte, and the year 1805. And they lived in my parents' dining room. And so I watched them as a child. And I remember asking my mom, what are these? And her telling me the stories about Jean Lafitte and such. And I think even though I didn't go on to study him, even as a historian until much later, I think it did inform my love of history, because I can remember looking at them and thinking, this is amazing. These were touched and written by someone 200 years ago. And I can see them right here. And this person lived in the same city that I'm living in now, but how different was that city when he walked the streets? And after Hurricane Katrina, which was a terrible hurricane that devastated the city of New Orleans in 2005, my parents' home was damaged. And it was at that point that they donated the papers to the historic New Orleans collection. And I was very glad that they did, because I had been long saying that they needed to be made available to scholars and needed to be cared for in a way that a private home could not. So scholars gained access to these papers, and they would ask my mom questions. They would call her up from time to time and say, where did you get these papers? And, what do you know about them? And that kind of thing. And then they would send her their books as a thank you for helping answer her questions. And as a historian, she knew I was interested in this kind of stuff, so she passed them along to me. So it was after, as an adult, reading what scholars were saying about Lafitte that got me interested in him. And what did it for me, and what made me decide there is a novel here, is that some scholars believe he faked his death in the 1820s, that he did not die then, that he actually went on to live for decades after that. And I thought, well, this is the perfect opportunity to let my creative imagination flow with the historical facts, because the historical facts surrounding this man's life are so unbelievable. If I wrote it as fiction, people probably wouldn't believe it, which is why at the end of the book I say, no, this really happened to him. This is the part that, I took creative liberty with. But to answer your original question, it was much later. I was an adult before I started to study him.
Absolutely, absolutely, Christy. So this book of yours, Lafitte Lives, is it about John Lafitte, or is it about about New Orleans, or is it about something else, part of history that you want to share people about?
It's all of the above, I would say. So the book is written as a story within a story. And this is not a spoiler because this happens in chapter 1, but Jean Lafitte had a half brother. Some people don't believe they were half brothers, but many do believe they were. His name is Dominic Yu. He was a Freemason, and he was buried in a cemetery, St. Louis Cemetery number 2 in New Orleans, in an above ground tomb, as people are. And so as the story opens, the caretaker or sexton of St. Louis Cemetery number 2, his name is Tobias Whitney, he comes across a journal hidden inside of Dominic's tomb that tells Jean Lafitte's story. So the book is about Tobias Whitney and his family, because he has a completely other story arc going on with him. It's about the story of Jean Lafitte, what actually happened to him, what might have happened to him had he faked his death. And it is, I very much think of New Orleans as a character in this book. I think it's very easy to do that because there's so many sensory details that go along with the city. And I tried to very much, starting from the absolute opening line of the book, to infuse that into the story. I want it to be immersive for a reader so that they feel like they've stepped back in time into early 19th century New Orleans with all of its, especially smells. I love to write smells because they stay with us, and they often weren't good that time period. So it is about all of those things coming together. And it is very much a history lesson of New Orleans and what it was like to live here during that time, but hopefully done in a way that is entertaining for a reader and engaging.
Absolutely. So how difficult, how challenging, how easy was it to write about something historical but in a fictional way, where New Orleans is also a character? You are a historian. You have to go back into time and also imagine about things, make it enough, interesting narrative for people of the present day to be interested in everything as a book.
Yes, I think that's a great question. And it was challenging, but for me, it was the most logical way to write a novel because I'm coming at it as a historian who is starting to write fiction. So I think in that way, I was more comfortable switching from nonfiction to fiction because it was historical fiction. But I will say, so much of my career has been in the classroom, and I have always believed that history is fascinating. I think you have to work to make history boring. I honestly do. It's if you like hearing stories, which is basically what reading is, right? We open up a book because we want to be transported into someone else's life, into their world, into their reality, even if their reality is fiction. And so it was quite easy, also because Jean Lafitte's life was so unbelievable and his so full of adventure that it absolutely lent itself to writing fiction. In fact, one of the challenges for me was making the fictional parts that I wrote match what actually happened to his life. Like, I had to write to that level. Otherwise, it would have kind of been, the fictitious part would have been boring. And hopefully I did that. I think I did, but that was definitely my intention, is to make it something that people didn't want to put down, that they just wanted to stay in that world.
Absolutely. So, was it a challenge that, that meeting the story has to be something that matches with the imagination of other people of John Lafitte? Or was it something that you want to portray him in a different light, which was much closer to history? Because you know more about these things than anybody average outside, even though they may have read about him, heard about him, experienced him in their own way. How was this whole experience about? Was there any particular mission in mind? Was it for the reader the mission, or was there anything else, that was in your mind in terms of, or was there any message that you wanted to give to people through your book?
Oh, absolutely. And I'll answer the last part of your question first. I think the message through Jean Lafitte's character, because I did make him into a fictional character, even though I kept as close as I could to historical record. He is a fictional character in this book, and it's very much about who I think he is and how I think he wants his story to be told. And so that's part of it. And between coming up with the answers to that for myself and the answers to what makes Tobias Whitney and Mary Catherine, his wife, tick, what are these overarching themes in my book? And that was a really important thing for me to get right. And the short answer to what did I want to say, what are the themes, is, it's about, it's about pirates and the irresistible lure of treasure, of course, but it's also about the transformative power of love and the strengths that we draw from the bonds we forge with other people. And that these bonds help us get through our darkest days. And it's also about the lengths we'll go to find a home and how important that is for us, and that loneliness that can compel us to risk everything to find our place in the world. So those are much larger messages that come through the fictional, characters in the story. But so I definitely wanted to create a book that could be read on various levels too. If you want to read it like a fun pirate story that's telling the life of Jean Lafitte, you can, but there's layers to be found if you dig a little bit deeper.
Absolutely. So for a lot of people, how, as a historian and as a fictional historian who writes historical fiction also, how would you want people in the future to understand about history? Should they understand history the way history has been written till now? Or should they understand history more through historical fiction? How would then they differentiate between reality as well as, and fiction?
Right. I think that I think first of all, just igniting an interest in history is so important. We have to know what came before us. I think it's a great lens for us to view not only the world that we're living in now, but also the world that we're creating, because every day you're creating, tomorrow's world. So any kind of historical fiction, I think, is good for that. I do think that there is a responsibility, or should be, to those of us who choose to write historical fiction, that we are getting it right, that we're getting our facts right. And if we're not, because it is fiction and it's okay to not get the facts right if you need to for the story, I do think that's okay. But I think it's important that you come clean with that and are very honest. This is what really happened. For the sake of the story, I might have fudged it a little bit, but I think that's important. And also, as a reader, I love the idea, and I've had people read my books and say this, like, after I read your book, I wanted to do research on Jean Lafitte. That's about the biggest compliment that a reader can give me, because now I've instilled in you a love of history and you want to go and learn. And so I think historical fiction appeals to lifelong learners. And I think that's something that we should all aspire to be. And so that's what I'm trying to do here, is get people to want to learn more about whatever part of history intrigues you. And of course, the more you read about different cultures, about different time periods, the broader understanding of the world you're going to have, and your whole worldview is going to be expanded. So that's a tall order for
Absolutely.
fiction, but I think historical fiction can do that for people.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Christy. Well put. About New Orleans as a character, how did you portray it? What was its role? Was it silent watching? Was it speaking? Was it feeling? Monologue? How have you portrayed it?
Well, it's in the background, and it is in mainly sensory detail. Having lived here all my life, I feel like when I read a book that's set in New Orleans, I can pretty much tell whether or not the author lives here. It's just little things like what was in bloom during what time of year, and what did that smell like, and what was it like walking the streets of the French Quarter? Literally, they were cobblestone. There was refuse running through them. All those kind of details, but and also New Orleans has it's just was such a melting pot in the early 19th century. It was very multicultural. I mean, you had enslaved individuals, you had free people of color, you had the Creoles, you had just a huge French population, to the point that French was the language mainly spoken at this time period in New Orleans. The mayor of New Orleans, for example, during the War of 1812, only spoke French. It's a major American city, and he doesn't speak English, didn't see the purpose to it. So it was so culturally diverse. And because it was a major port city, there were goods and people and ideas flowing in from the Mississippi River every single day. So it is very much sort of like a living entity all on its own. And it is buzzing in the background of the entire book. I mean, there's no way it could have not been set in New Orleans and not had made it into, being a character there.
Absolutely. So, does this living entity tell you whether you would like to be in the past a New Orleans, or is it the present that is okay with it? What does New Orleans say about that, with so many things that has happened, not in the very recent, not in the very distant past, very close by?
Yes, I think, I just was doing an author talk at this really quaint bookshop in the middle of the French Quarter, steps away from Pirates Alley, where Jean Lafitte had his marketplace. And it was an amazing venue, because you could just almost feel the history all around you. The French Quarter looks very much like it did in the early 19th century. And I think that was a great way to get inspiration for me. Just having lived here and walked the streets, it's like, it makes it so much easier to imagine what it was like, because it's a place where the past is very much alive. And it is still very multicultural, very diverse. And it's also a place where juxtaposition lies very easily. So what I mean by that is, you'll be walking past this early 19th century building. Some are older than that, but a lot were destroyed in fires. And then there's a neon sign attached to it. So it has that juxtaposition of old and new, history and present, alive in it, all of the time. So it makes for an easy place for a historian or an author, or both, to gain inspiration just by walking the streets.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, in a nutshell, what would you like to tell people about history, historical fiction, about John Lafitte, about your book? And is this the only book, or you are going to write much more historical fiction?
I already have, actually. So when I wrote Lafitte Lives, I thought it was a standalone book, and I was quite happy with that. And then, got a publisher for it, started going through that whole process. And I realized a couple months later that those characters were not done. It's kind of funny that that's how that worked. It wasn't that I wasn't done with the characters. The characters were living rent-free in my head, and they weren't going anywhere. So I talked to my publisher and, wrote a pitch, and we decided that there would be more books to come using the same characters. And it got to the point where by the time I wrote the second one, it was so entwined. There were so many callbacks to Lafitte Lives that we ended up making Lafitte Lives a prequel. So the stories are, the series is called The Old New Orleans Bookshop Mysteries. And they focus on Tobias's wife, Mary Catherine, because she's ended up being my favorite character. And she is becomes known as an amateur sleuth in early 19th century New Orleans, and people come to her to solve mysteries. So there will be at least 3 more books. The first one, well, I guess it's now the second one in that series after Lafitte Lives, is called The Swamp Ghost, and that comes out in September. So, and I'm working on the third one right now. So many more to come.
Wonderful.
Hopefully.
Many more to come. So there's so much to learn about history, learn from your book, and I'm sure learn from all the books that are yet to come, many more to come. What's the best way for people to connect with you?
Probably my website, because I'm getting ready to release the first chapter of The Swamp Ghost. And if you sign up on my website, I'll, get that straight to your inbox. But it will also show, I'll do anytime there's a podcast or a new release, it'll be on there. And that is just my first and last name, Christi Sumich, altogether.com. And, my books are available wherever you buy books from major retailers. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and of course, working on those local bookstores, quite a few in New Orleans, but maybe not so much in India yet.
Wonderful. Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.